When the Sega Saturn launched in Japan, I was just turning 19 years old. I was out of school, I was working full-time, and I had some money to spend. I had already become familiar with importing games from Japan at this point, and now that the Saturn was out, I was dipping my toes into that market more than ever. It was one hell of an exciting time, and I have many fond memories of it. However, like most things in life, there were moments of genuine regret while importing for the Saturn. Times where I made bad choices, overpaid, or just ended up with a game that failed to meet my expectations. That's where this video comes in. I have selected a number of Sega Saturn games from Japan that I really wish I hadn't gone after. It's important to note that not all these games are bad games in the strictest of terms. They just happen to have a story behind them, very specific to me as the buyer. I've got 14 of them, so let's get started. First on our list is Deus, the robotic first-person shooter that was developed by Micronet and Genki. In the early days of my Saturn ownership, I had played Virtua Fighter to death, and I was looking desperately for something new to play. In March of 1995, Deus launched in Japan, and I was enamored with the pictures in the gaming magazines. Doom with robots is fully what I was expecting, yet this slow, plodding, poor-performing game was nothing of the kind. Essentially, you are a rebel agent trying to bring down a massive space station that rules the Earth with an iron fist. You walk around nondescript halls and rooms blasting away at ho-hum enemies that offer little in the way of excitement or challenge. Your weapons mostly suck, the objectives lack any real tension, and you'll likely be bored to death by the second or third stage. To make matters worse, I paid well over $100 for this at its release. I was so excited for a new Saturn game, I had it shipped next day air as soon as my favorite import company got it in. It was an immediate regret that I couldn't return or sell to recoup my funds. Sega published this Japanese version, but opted out of the US edition, leaving that one to be handled by Acclaim. If that doesn't say everything, I don't know what else does. Super Adventure Rockman was a mid-1998 release that I wouldn't get until sometime later, but it was a bad pickup either way. This is the full motion video equivalent to a Mega Man game. Dr. Wily discovers some ancient technology in the Amazon that allows him to bring back his previous creations, on top of some other terrible things like corrupting modern technology. Of course, the Blue Bomber and pals are the only ones that can stop this. It's set up as an adventure game where you can choose different options to progress the story. Cinematics play out, which then lead into QuickTime events and shooting segments, which you must then survive to keep the action going. It was an odd choice for Capcom to pursue this in 1998. I could have seen them trying it when full motion video was being heavily pushed on something like the Sega CD, and the technology was relatively new to console gamers, but by 1998 nobody cared. That may be why they only published it in Japan, which of course meant that someone like me couldn't understand the voice work. Not really sure why I wanted this in my Saturn collection, and the only time I touch it these days is to record footage for the channel.
待ってたぜ。メタルブレードの切れ味をその体で試すがいい。
I am a big fan of fighting games. Good fighting games, that is. In June of 1995, I was victim of the unfortunate release of Battle Monsters. This was developed by Scarab and published by Naxat Soft, a two-dimensional fighter that I thought might be fun considering its wacky cast and digitized graphics. Kind of a ripoff of Mortal Kombat, but this doesn't deserve to be mentioned in the same sentence as Midway's classic. It had some stupid ass story about winning a tournament to rule the underworld, but none of that matters in the least during the actual game. I know some of you enjoy stuff like this for the lulz, but I couldn't stomach it for much more than a few minutes. The crazy camera zooming constantly, the terrible models, the overly busy backdrops, and the garbage flow of the gameplay in general are instant killers of any fun. This is another one that Acclaim swooped in and grabbed up the license to release in the West. Where Acclaim saw value, it typically meant pain and suffering for its customers. Battle Monsters was soon lost in a sea of much better fighting games. A complete disaster, no matter which region you owned. With games like Afterburner 2 and Outrun turning out so well on the Saturn, 1998's Galaxy Force 2 was a surefire winner, right? Not so fast, my Sega-loving friends. This was part of the Sega Ages line for the Saturn, but unfortunately was handled by different developers than the other Superscaler ports. This was done by Appaloosa Interactive, and their work is not something I was happy with. The performance is not arcade smooth. In fact, it's not even consistent. By this point, bringing this home anything less than perfect was utterly pointless. It isn't that it's unplayable or anything, it was just that when you had a console with the sprite capabilities of the Saturn, it should have been special. Better than the arcade even. Instead, we are left with a forgettable port that only really gives you a taste of the powerful arcade original. It blows the Mega Drive attempt out of the water, but this was still a big letdown that sits idle in my Saturn collection. Golden Axe The Duel makes the list because of my own insurmountable expectations. This was developed internally by Sega and released on the Saturn in September of 1995. This had the license, it had the development talent, and it had the two-dimensional power to make it something special. I went in expecting Sega to have hit a home run here, of unforgettable quality. Instead, I was met with nothing more than an average fighter with a pretty face. The Neo Geo level visuals are not hard on the eyes, but they also don't scream something to push the Saturn very hard. The Street Fighter inspired gameplay is similar in that regard. It uses the familiar motions you know and love from Capcom's classics, but doesn't really do anything beyond that to define or warrant its existence. That left me wanting it to be more than it was, especially for the import premium I paid for it. This was another one that landed around the $100 mark, which adjusted for inflation would be like paying over $200 for a game today. It was far from the worst fighter on the Saturn, but it certainly wasn't worth that kind of price. Nearly 4 years into the run of the Saturn, it was clear Sega was pushing a replacement and its days were numbered. Importing had become pretty hit and miss at that time, with even Model 2 ports having quality that wasn't always a surefire hit. 1998's GT24 by Jellicoe was one such game. It's based on the Model 2 Super GT 24 Hours, an arcade racer based on endurance racing that can take place across day and night. You'll need a decent pit crew to work your car, keeping it running and keep you competitive. Unfortunately, this is pared down from the arcade release heavily. The polygon draw distance is closer, the textures are far worse, the performance is halved, and the overall track detail is cut back heavily. Importing this one left me in a rather bewildered state. The Saturn had been churning out incredible Model 2 ports there for a few years thanks to the likes of Virtua Fighter 2, Virtua Cop, and a number of others. But as 1997 and 1998 came into focus, Model 2 ports seemed to be nowhere near as well done as before. GT24 was similar to releases like Sky Target, House of the Dead, and Sega Touring Car, games that failed to look, run, or play as well as you'd expect. GT24 was yet another disappointment as the Saturn slowly faded from the retail market. Mega Man X3 was another game I wanted so badly to like, but just felt burned by the experience. Before I begin, I want to be very clear here that I'm not attacking this game for its quality, but rather its conversion over to the Saturn. If you enjoy the Mega Man X series, this was more of what you loved about it. Unfortunately, the Saturn port is nothing special over the 16-bit Super Nintendo original. There is an added arranged soundtrack and new cinematics, but nothing has been upgraded beyond that. Since the Saturn doesn't support the original Super Nintendo resolution, it runs with vertical borders and what appears to be squashed sprites. I found this incredibly off-putting for a supposed 32-bit release. Instead of more colors, more detailed sprites, better backgrounds, or some new special effects, we are running around in a smaller screen with characters that look wrong. I had jumped the gun without knowing what I was getting, and paid another premium for a game I instantly regretted. It never came to the US but did see a release in a number of PAL territories. If you want to play it, do it on the Super Nintendo. Mega Man X4 was far more impressive for a 32-bit release. A number of my friends were importing games around this time, and one of them picked up Shin Shinobi as soon as it was released. That was in June of 1995, and it was developed by Sega. Though it contains the Shinobi name and is part of that series, it is not a sequel or related to the previous games in any way. It follows the story of two brothers, one good and one only concerned with power. As you can imagine, the latter starts trouble, a girl is involved, and you'll need to whoop ass to stop him. My experience with this one started out decent enough. After my buddy beat it a few times, he sold it to me. I didn't think much of the digitized visuals, and I thought the soundtrack was just okay compared to past Shinobi titles, but the gameplay was very similar to Shinobi 3, and that was a very good thing. The main hero could run, block, and double jump, with the use of both his sword and throwing knives as options to defeat enemies. Ninja magic makes a return as well. Where things go wrong with this import for me is when I learned of the PAL release later that year. That region recorded a completely different soundtrack for the game, and was a bit more faithful to the spirit of the Genesis releases. It was known as Shinobi X, and it's the version I wish I had gotten. I'll leave you with an example of the changes so you can hear them for yourself. Sega's Japanese champion, Segata Senshiro, was an iconic figure that got his very own game in late 1998 called Shinken Yugi. No doubt the character deserves some love, and it's a shame that this is the best Sega could do. But what do you expect when you allow the developer responsible for the reprehensible Death Crimson to make it? Yep, the folks at Eckel strike again with this turd, a collection of minigames that give way to videos of our heroes' exploits. The minigames are, in a word, awful, with even the more tolerant ones being little more than barely playable curiosities that you hope give way to some of the trademark humor. It doesn't, and what you are left with here is a game in its simplest form. You do control some of the on-screen action, but there's nothing really to learn. It's mostly just memory and matching crap. Nothing really brings you back for more, and more importantly, there's nothing beyond the fleeting joy of seeing the Sega hero on screen every so often. Sega charged damn near full price for this mess, and it still sits in my collection as a testament to my past addictions. Remember when I said it seemed like Model 2 arcade ports to the Saturn seemed to get worse as the machine aged? That was certainly the case with 1997's Sky Target. This was developed by Appaloosa Interactive for Sega, a port of the AM1 arcade original. It's basically the first Polygon addition to the Afterburner series of games. As cool as that sounds, it really did not translate over well. It's slower and just doesn't have the same intensity. It was that intensity that was 90% of the Afterburner experience. The Saturn port of this adds further issues with poor polygon models, crappy looking environments, and some truly awful textures. I imported this at its release for full price, putting it damn near $100 once you included shipping. I grew tired of this fast and was another one I wish I had passed on. When this came out in the US 4 months later, Sega had the audacity to put on the back of the box arcade perfect translation and incredible real-time 3D environments. It was a shameful day to be a Sega fan. Late 1997 gave us the Athena-developed Crows the Battle action on the Sega Saturn. I was so incredibly excited to get this one because I was totally sold on a 2D beat-em-up with 32-bit graphics, animation, and sound. Crows certainly looked the part, those large sprites were excellent, but it just didn't grab me with its gameplay. It's here where the basics fall to pieces. There are no real combos that lead into more powerful moves. Instead, almost everything is a standalone hit, and the best you can get are a few moves that hit more than once so you can knock the enemy down faster. There are also no flashy specials here to keep things interesting. You will go into this entire game with simple punches, kicks, throws, and weapons that do not chain into more satisfying damage. And that's the entire game. It's based on a Japanese comic of the same name, but this meant absolutely nothing to me because I wasn't familiar with it and the game is all in Japanese. There are a handful of different characters with different styles, but nothing here keeps you coming back. Die-hard fans of the genre may squeeze some enjoyment out of it, but those looking for something in the same league as Streets of Rage or Final Fight can keep on looking. When Street Fighter Real Battle on Film released in Japan on the Saturn, I was pretty excited to play it. I was completely under the impression it was a port of the arcade game, Street Fighter the Movie, but instead it was just Super Turbo with digitized actors from the movie. To make matters worse, I didn't check the opposing US release date before paying a premium for the Japanese version, which just happened to be a few weeks later. This was one of those moments where you just had to hang your head low and admit you had been a dumbass. A quick question to any Babbage's employee would have set me straight, and I would have known all I needed. I ended up liking this a lot more than I care to admit. Yeah, the visuals are kinda crappy and the music is generic as can be, but the Super Turbo gameplay feels pretty damn good. It makes this list not because I hated it, but because I would have much rather have spent a lot less money on it. It was the type of mistake I shouldn't have made after importing for years, but I'd make many more in the years that followed.
You win!
Thunderstorm and Road Blaster was the type of release that should have been a winner. It dropped in late 1995 and included two of the Data East developed arcade classic Laserdisc titles. First up was Thunderstorm, which was also known as Cobra Command, a helicopter game where you must fight your way through an evil terrorist group as they assault multiple locations. As you'd expect of full motion video, it's basically QuickTime events to keep the on-rails action going. Miss a shot or a turn and you'll flame out and need to replay the section again. This port is pretty good and much closer to the arcade than the Sega CD edition. What I wanted the most, however, was Road Blaster, also known as Road Avenger and Road Prosecutor. I adored this on the Sega CD. It was one of the few full motion video games that I would go back to again and again because of the story and music. You are on a mission of revenge against the Road Gang who had been terrorizing the city and killed your wife. The opening theme was epic and so incredibly memorable. I cut my Sega CD on back then just to let the game run watching that intro over and over. The Saturn version of the game strips that intro down to some soulless rock music with no lyrics. To make matters worse, it also puts a giant reticle and score on the screen, which really affect the immersion. It just doesn't feel like the same game. Luckily I didn't get this at its original release, but I still paid more for it than I wanted. I know that the Sega CD version had changes from the Laserdisc arcade original, but those changes made that game so unforgettable for me, and it's still my favorite version by a mile. Our last game is one of those titles you grab up on a whim because the console it's for already has so many great additions to the genre, and it's part of a series that you enjoyed in the past. That happened with 1997's Terra Terra 3D. You may remember some of the previous releases in the series like Moon Crusta or Terra Force, all of which were vertically scrolling shoot-'em-ups with the cool mechanic of interconnected ships flying together. Nihon Bussen took the basics of that idea and tried to make a 3D entry into the series, and it was a straight-up disaster. It's a slow, plodding mess of polygons with no discernible details on the enemies or in the environments. Its gameplay is woefully boring, the kind of thing that leaves you wondering if anyone involved in its development actually played what they were making. There's no eye candy to liven up the action, no great soundtrack to drive your will to survive, no interesting power-ups to tie it all together. Instead, it was nothing more than an attempt to revive past success by slapping polygons all over everything. It was a sham, a hustle, and a piss-poor game in every imaginable way. I could have accepted had it been a 1993 release on something like the 3DO or Jaguar, but by 1997, there was just no excuse for software of this caliber on the 3-year-old Sega Saturn. And there we have it, some Sega Saturn imports I regret for one reason or another. I wanted to do this episode for a few reasons, chief among them that importing wasn't always a home run filled with great purchases. Every so often you would make mistakes, bad choices, or just luck into a game that wouldn't meet your expectations. Those expectations would often come about through circumstance, ignorance, or even overexcitement, and it wasn't always because the game was poor. Sometimes the game just wasn't what you thought it'd be, or wasn't exactly what you wanted. You'll also notice a number of these titles saw release outside of Japan eventually. A big part of the appeal of Japanese games back then was they almost always released there first. Sometimes you would import software knowing an eventual Western release was likely, or even already announced. You just wanted it as early as possible and were willing to pay a premium for it. I also wanted to share with you what is hopefully the start of a new series of videos based on the same topic. I could also do import games I regretted for other Sega consoles like the Genesis and Dreamcast, or go outside the Sega Solar System for machines like the Nintendo 64 or original PlayStation. Let me know down in the comments if any of that interests you. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.